Morning, everybody. Good to see everybody. And tonight we're going to pick back up in the middle of Lesson 8 and where we had left off. And that was at the top of page 4 where we were going to look at the precepts for the food. But before we do, got a question. Now, this wasn't anything major, but it was something factual that I had misconceptions about throughout my life, and I was wondering, and I've racked my brain trying to figure out where I got these ideas, but did anybody do any looking about the quail? Just want to talk about that briefly. So the question was, quail the whole period of the wandering, or was it limited? What was the scope? So what are some of the ideas that are out there? The idea I grew up with, that I had in my head, was man in the morning, quail in the evening. That's the way it was all day, every day. And through my studies in this, I've come to the conclusion that that was wrong. The manna did. Correct. So there's some things we can infer about this. So I think there's something to this, because in chapter 16, verse 35, and the sons of Israel ate the manna 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. So that says that very specifically that manna was their main sustenance for the whole time, right? Yeah. So then how often did they have quail that was provided miraculously by God? At least once. Does that indicate that in this account? And that ain't right. So how many times? At least once. The answer is 2 times. Now, the second time actually reveals categorically that this was not an everyday thing, I think, that you can't get around it. Numbers chapter 11. Now, as you're getting to Numbers chapter 11, on the back page of your lesson that you got tonight, there's a timeline. Sinai chronology. And if you see there, I know that some of the writing's a little small, but so departing Egypt during the first year, arriving at Sinai. So during that 2-month period, from departing Egypt and arriving at Sinai is when we find out about the... Nice of you to show up. Look, everybody, look. Do you have this? Okay, all right. So during that time is when what we read back here in Exodus chapter 16, when the manna the first time. So that's in that timeline. What we're about to read now occurs after they leave Sinai, which is at the far right of this, where they're leaving. Okay? So if you see there at the bottom, total time at Sinai, 11 months, 20 days. If you see that, that encompasses this whole thing just about from left to right. So once they leave is off this chart. What we're reading today is off this chart. It's after they left Sinai in Numbers. Okay? Here's what it says in Numbers. The beginning, it says the people complain. And chapter 11 in Numbers, verse 2. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out, so that the name of the place there was Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now, and the rabble who were among them had greedy desires also, and wept. Also the sons of Israel wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat?" Wait a minute. We're getting meat every night, right? So what are they? Who will give us meat to eat? What's that saying? We don't have any. And we've not had any for a long time. Now look at this. We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlics, but now our appetite is gone. There's nothing at all to look at except what? At manna and all this quail. If they was getting quail every night, wouldn't it say that? Okay, so they're complaining that they don't have meat. Right? So then it tells us some things and whatnot. Then in verse 10, now Moses heard the weeping throughout the families, each man at the doorway of the tent, the anger of the Lord. So Moses, verse 11, why hast thou been so hard on thy servant, and so forth and so on. And we come down over to verse 31. So they want meat, haven't had meat, and God provides what? Quail. Well, if they were eating quail every night, then God provided them quail. That makes no sense whatsoever. Does it? Now there went forth a wind from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall. Now this is where it does say that they picked up a whole bunch. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, which is a bunch. I forget how many bushels it is. That in your notes there? Okay. I just wondered if you had your homer to bushel calculations. Griff's good at math, so he may know that. But so the question is, well, not the question, but something additional happens here. So when they gathered it, and then something additional happens, they had, before it was verse 33, while the meat was still between their teeth, because they ate too quickly. And there was selfishness involved here. It was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. So the name of the place was called Kibroth HaTavah, because they were buried and the people had been greedy. Okay, so then it tells that they set out from there to go to another place. Question? Well, the question, the thing that if you look back here, I think in verse 11 it talks about, or chapter 11, that it does talk about that there wasn't enough for them. Okay, yeah, verse 21. But Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot, yet thou hast said, I will give them meat in order that they may eat for a whole month. Should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient for them, or should all the fish of the sea be gathered for them to be sufficient for them? And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true or not. So the idea here is that if they permitted the eating of their herds, that would not sustain the amount of people that would have wiped them out as they travel, is the way I understand it. So they did not use them for those purposes. Yes, they complained because obviously they weren't permitted somehow or another to use those. Now, I don't know, it's not explicitly stated, but here if you have approximately 2 million people, it's not going to take long to wipe out what they had. Now that was a year and a half, 12 months ago. Right. Right. They did know it was possible, yes. And so they murmured again and stuff, and this is what happened. They were so greedy in what they had gathered that in the fact that they're greed before the meat was in their teeth, there was a plague that broke out. So, So I'm firmly on the conclusion that it was only 2 times. Any questions or comments on that before we move on? Okay. All right. So we're beginning at the top of page 4. I've got another question coming for you here in a little bit. I want you to think on. So precepts for the food. We've been talking about the problem that they had, the pain of hunger, the prediction of the food that was to come, and the things that were told to Moses. We're going to be back in Exodus chapter 16. And then there were precepts for the food. Chapter 16, verses 19 through 30. Would someone read that for me? Who's got that? Wants to give it a shot? Phil, you want to help me out with that? Okay. Chapter 16, verses 19 through 30. All right. Thank you very much. So 2 major restrictions were placed on the use of the bread of the Lord. So this is obviously talking about all the manna. It was not to be kept overnight. The people were to trust the Lord to provide their daily bread. Some ignored this command, and by morning the bread of the Lord stunk and was full of maggots. Now Moses became angry at the deliberate disobedience of the people to the first precept. On the 6th day, the people went to gather twice the amount of the bread of the Lord as they gathered on the preceding days. When this was reported to Moses, he revealed a second divine command, namely that the 7th day was to be a day of rest. Some of the people tested the second precept. They went out to gather the bread of the Lord on the 7th day and found none. They disobeyed. Some kept more than they should, that they weren't to keep any overnight. And then it wouldn't surprise me if these are the very same ones who headed out on the 7th day to gather some. And again, they deliberately disobeyed. Now, my question to you is, which commandment were they breaking when they went to look out, when they went out on the 7th day? Which commandment were they breaking? Which commandment? Sabbath day holy. Which commandment is that? 4th. So they were breaking the 4th commandment? What hadn't happened yet? There are no commandments yet. Ha ha! You were looking back in there for Exodus. You was looking for it, wasn't you? I was like, 1, 2, 3. Oh, yeah, Exodus. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about this later because we have a little bit of a window into. We talked about this some on Sunday night in the patriarchal age, right? Is that still happening as we speak? Yes. No, I'm talking about then. At that point in time, when Moses was happening, the patriarchal age, when this happened with the manna, was the patriarchal age still in effect? Yes. Why? What hasn't happened yet? The Sinai covenant. So everything, whatever they were operating under, whatever system, whatever, we've got windows into this, it's still the patriarchal age until the Sinai covenant, a couple more chapters. At that point, then it's a whole new ball of wax. But we do see some of these things that were taught and observed before the law was given. Give me some other examples of things that were taught and observed before the law was given that were laying the groundwork for what would happen in the Sinai covenant. Okay, tithing, giving, yeah. How do we know that took place prior to the Sinai? Melchizedek and Abraham, we know that there were some for, yeah. What else? Sacrifices, what evidence do we have of that? Cain, what about Cain and Abel? What they offered? Yeah, from the very get-go. And then where else? Yes. So was that wasn't, there was obviously something. They wanted to go into the wilderness to offer sacrifices. So there was something to that. So these things took place prior to the Sinai covenant. The law was given. So there were things that were laying the groundwork, that were part of what was happening, that carried into this new covenant. Noah offered sacrifices, right? Right. So there had to be some sort of commands for these things. In fact, when we get up to Jethro, when we get into finding out what's going on with him, we're going to find out some stuff about him and these things. So under the patriarchal age, God worked in and through these patriarchs in order to communicate his desires as to how he would be worshiped. And these things were all part of what they practiced before the law. See, this Sabbath here, it's shortly going to be part of the new covenant, but this is a precept and a thing that was established even before that, that's going to be made even more clear in the Ten Commandments and the whole Levitical law that's going to be given. So, yes, which a bit of a trick question. So, precepts for the food, these were the things. They were to not keep any overnight, and they were to gather 2 days worth on the day preceding the Sabbath. Now, we have God had given the seventh day of Israel as a day of rest. People were not to venture out of their tents on the Sabbath. Now, preservation of manna. The bread of the Lord, this is beginning with verses 31 through 36. And the house of Israel named it manna, and it was like coriander seed wine, and its taste was like wafers with honey. Then Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omerful of it be kept throughout your generations, that they may see the bread that I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omerful of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations." As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. Just curious. You notice anything about that word testimony if it's written? Does anybody have anything other than testimony in your Bible? In verse 34? Everybody have testimony? Anything unique about that word? Capitalize. Huh? Huh. And the sons of Israel ate the manna 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now an omer is a tenth of an ephah. So, we're going to talk about this here in a minute. What's this talking about? That there was a written word at this point? Okay. Possibly. We'll get there in a second. Randy, I see your hand there, so I'm going to give you a chance here when we get to it. Now, the bread of the Lord was given the name manna. What is it? So this was a really powerful, meaningful, spiritual name, right? No, there's no. I mean, this is just what the people called it. What is it? That's that manna that became the name. The color and taste of this substance are described by the narrator. Manna was like white, like a coriander seed, and it had a honey-like taste. Now, the coriander plant found in Egypt and Palestine bears seed-like fruit. The dried leaves are used for seasoning, and oil is produced from the seeds. God directed Moses to preserve some of the manna for posterity. Aaron collected an omer of manna in a pot and placed it before Yahweh. In verse 34, it says that this omer of manna was placed before the testimony where it was to be kept. Now, actually, the clue to helping us understand this is actually the context of verse 35. Verse 35 says, and the sons of Israel ate the manna 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. So, we tend to think of what happened here with the Lord providing the quail, the manna being out the next day. They get these commandments. Moses explains to them what's going on. We think in chronological fashion, yes? So then when we get to these verses, we think we're continuing a day-by-day, minute-by-minute chronology, don't we? But that's not what's happening here once we get to these verses. These are parenthetical statements summarizing things that would happen. Randy, you had a thought about the testimony? Yes. Okay, but these are talking about these two things, that the precepts for the food, these commandments regarding these food, these were not, when it says commandments, it doesn't mean the 10 commandments. It just means what he commanded, what he just told them about the day before. They turn around that week, and that's what he's talking. That's not making reference to the 10 commandments or the law given at Sinai. So what this is doing is giving us a little foreshadowing of what was coming. So what was coming? What did Randy say? The Ark of the Covenant, right? And the testimony would be what? The Ark itself? What was in it? What was in it? The pot of manna was in there with what else? Aaron's staff and the 10 Commandments themselves. These all were the testimony that testified as an ongoing thing. So what this is doing, it's speaking parenthetically of what happened in a nutshell and what would happen. And so the subject is, this is the institution of manna and what would be happening. And here's a statement about what we did to remember it moving forward. But that didn't happen until we built the Ark of the Covenant and then placed it in there. So this didn't happen until then. And you see how verse 35 gives us a real context there? What's verse 35 tell us? Ate it for 40 years. So this is commentary on manna and then how it was instituted and what it meant and how it was preserved for posterity. Does that all make sense? So the testimony per se, did it exist at this point in time? But it would. And this is a writing technique, that could be used. Okay? So the narrator closes the account by noting that the Israelites ate manna for 40 years. And just again, they didn't eat what for 40 years? Quail. Until they reached the border of the promised land. And then another really interesting parenthetical statement adds an omer is a tenth of an ephah. Yeah. So they wanted to make sure that they knew what the omer was. Now, as I understand it, it wasn't as common a usage of measurement as the ephah was. So it was less common, but I think that's what I remember seeing about that. But it was a very interesting parenthetical statement. So, any questions about anything surrounding the manna and all that? All right, good. So now we're going to move on to our third problem, and that is the problem of thirst. In Exodus 17, 1 through 7. Would someone like to give that, read that for me? Okay.
Then all the congregations of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. How you pronounce it?
Rephidim.
Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, "Why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do to these people? And a little more time, and a little more, and they will stone me." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, take your hand, your staff, with you, which you struck in the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock of Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and the water will come out of it, and the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he named the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "The Lord is among us, or not."
Okay. So, we have another issue here of thirst. Now, remember how we talked about this initially, that their initial supplies of water run out and they're traveling, and how it was a very, very much a time of uncertainty. And we said that they came to a place that was very disappointing to them. Where was that place of disappointment when they thought they had found water? What you guys? Yeah, Marah. Yeah, M-A-R-A-H. They named it that because the water was bitter, brackish. And so that was very disappointing for them. And then from that point forward, they moved forward to a place and they found water. Remember what was significant about that? Yeah, 12 springs and 70 palms. Yeah, and so they found water there. And so that was provided for them in that place. And here again we have another issue with thirst. And this is a little different, though, in the way that they reacted, because to this point they've had multiple providential acts for them, hadn't they? Multiple providential things that provided for their needs as they began to travel. They've had manna, they've had quail, they've had the first time of water and all these different things. The water was made fresh by the stick that Moses put on it, and then they found another place with springs of water and so forth. So there were many times when God was providing for them in these needs. And now we're going to see that this is a little even more intense than what had been happening before. So the Israelites eventually came to Rephidim in their journey. Here they found no water. For the fourth time the people complained. This time they went beyond grumbling. And it says they quarreled. That word quarreled there is what it means is actually it's more intense. They're starting to get to the point of violence. They quarreled against Moses. Murmuring here is an attitude that God is insufficient in difficulties. Now, had they seen that God was sufficient in difficulties to this point? I mean, time after time, right? Now, Moses, or at Marah, they had asked Moses, "What shall we drink?" At Rephidim, after 3 food miracles they had already witnessed along the way, they demanded that Moses produce water. Moses considered himself powerless. Quarreling with him would do them no good. He wanted them that they were putting away, that he warned them, that's supposed to be warned them, that they were putting God to the test with their demand. Now, Hebrews chapter 3, verses 7 through 13, Would someone read that for us? Hebrews chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. Anyone have that one? Kelly, you got it? Chapter 3, verses 7 through 13.
Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me. And in the day of trial, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they did not know my way. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take care, brethren, lest there should be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart in falling away from the living God. But encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, lest any of you be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin.
Okay, so this passage here in Hebrews is referring to this incident and others, and concluded that murmuring leads to the hardness of heart and the loss of standing with God. Moses' warning had temporary calming effect upon the people, but soon they were grumbling again. They continued to accuse Moses of leading them out of the wilderness to their death. Now, the crowd was on the verge of stoning him, and this drove the prophet to his knees. The Lord directed Moses to leave the camp and take some of the elders with him to serve as reliable witnesses. Now, there's two thoughts on this. He went outside the camp and was instructed to take elders with him and do this. There's different perspectives on this. One perspective is this, that the elders were the only ones that were permitted to see what was about to happen, that the people didn't deserve, because of their hardness of heart and their murmuring, to see another miracle. Another thought was this, that they were able to witness it, and that the elders were taken with them as a sign of accountability, that they were being held accountable for the people as a whole in their murmuring, almost like they were being scolded. So it's two interesting thoughts and things that I read on that. I think either one is possible. Either one is possible. So, the Lord directed Moses to leave the camp and take some of the elders. And Moses was to take his staff and strike a rock beside which the Lord himself would be standing. So, that is an interesting thing there. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. Now, that's verse 6. Now, that's a very interesting thing, isn't it, to think about? Now, to this point, have we had anything like this occur? The cloud and the pillar of fire, those Christophanies, theophanies that we talked about, the manifestations we've talked about, and this is another one that Moses was going to take part in, and he was to take the. Now, there's something else interesting in this verse, in verse 6. What do you think that is? The rock where? Where's this rock? Horeb. Remember what we talked about? About the land of Midian and Horeb and the burning bush. And so we are in the very close vicinity of the actual mount. In these mountains, whether the range was called Horeb, then Sinai itself, they're in that very general vicinity. And if you recall back to the documentary, again, this was a very interesting find with the split rock and the evidence of water erosion in a place where there's half an inch of rain every 10 years. Half an inch every 10 years. That is dry. That is dry. And so it's very possible that was the place, and it's very much in the vicinity of the mountain itself. And we're going to find out there's another clue, I think, that they are in the very close vicinity of Midian. And Midian is where it's at. And I think all that's very strong. There's another clue we're going to see here in a little bit. I think it's very strong evidence. And you'll see here. So Horeb, they're basically where they're about to be, where they're going to be for a while. Now, Moses did as the Lord instructed, and when he struck the rock, water gushed forth. Anybody have 1 Corinthians 10:4 handy? This is speaking specifically of this event. Anybody there?
All drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from the spiritual rock which all men, and the rock was Christ.
Right. So the Lord was there at the rock when it was split, and this is Christ speaking of himself and what was happening here. This is very significant. Now, when we talk about waters of life and these kind of things, I mean, this is definitely typology of what we're saying here, that Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment of this. Now, some have suggested, now put on your thinking caps again, some have suggested that Moses struck a thin layer of limestone rock that covered a vein of water. This is their explanation. Now, again, why would someone attempt to find this solution for this? That Moses had his staff, and he just was guided to a spot where there was a thin thing, limestone, and then he broke that, and that's how they found water. There are people that try to interpret this without miracles being possible, in that they're approaching it from a naturalistic, materialistic point of view. Again, the problem with this view is that the rocks in that area are granite, not limestone. That's fine and dandy, if you want to say that that's the one problem. To me, that's not the major problem. The major problem is that it doesn't matter what kind of rock it was. Does it? I mean, it doesn't matter even if there was limestone there. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it says that this was a miraculous event because God was involved, and this was now going to be providing water for a long period of time for over 2 million people and their livestock. This was not a water fountain, little trickle. This was a substantial amount of water, and again, in my mind, it goes back to what we saw in the documentary. Now, Moses gave 2 names to that spot: Meribah, which means quarreling, and Massah, testing. Now, here's a devotional note. Whenever God's people begin to demand a miracle to prove that God is in their midst, they are repeating the sin of Israel at Massah. Now, does this happen today? Give me an example. Need a sign. Okay. They need some sort of miraculous sign that God is doing something. Those that say that tongue speaking is necessary, is that not demanding God to do a miracle? Miraculous healing, is that not demanding God to do a miracle? To prove that He's there in their midst? That's repeating this sin. So, that was the problem of thirst. Now we have the problem of war. Verse 8. Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose men for us and go out and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." And Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hand up that Israel prevailed, and when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But when Moses' hands were heavy, then they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar, and there named it, "The Lord is my banner." And he said, "The Lord has sworn, and the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation." So when the Israelites were encamped at Rephidim, they were attacked by the Amalekites. You guys know who the descendants are? You reading ahead? Amalek is a descendant of Esau. Now, was Amalek the only descendant of Esau? Got 50-50 shot here. That's it. No, he wasn't, right? Right? I believe the Edomites were descendant of Esau. He had other descendants, but now, were Esau's descendants normally warm and fuzzy toward the Israelites? These were, throughout their history, were constant thorns in the side of the Israelites. And here's one, as they're traveling, and they're going to be held accountable here for what they've done. So, these were the descendants of Esau. The Amalekites pounced upon the stragglers who were weary and worn out from the journey. And so you can find evidence of this if you want to read there in Deuteronomy 25. Now Joshua, mentioned here for the first of 27 times in the Pentateuch, was delighted to organize a fighting force to deal with the threat. So this is the first time we meet Joshua. Now I think this is significant. So, out of all these people, what was it about Joshua that Moses chose him? Faithful? That ain't happened yet. So what was it about Joshua? He stood out, right? I mean, he had to have stood out in some form or fashion as being a godly man, one that could handle such a task. He must have been a mighty warrior. You wouldn't send someone out that you wouldn't trust to go into battle, and not just go into battle, but lead men into battle, put together a force. So he must have been a man among men. I mean, don't you think? There had to be something about him, and then to know what happens moving forward, God is working here and preparing him for what would be coming as well. You think at this point when Joshua was taking this challenge of Moses to do this, that at any point that Joshua would realize that sometime in the future that he himself would be in Moses' position? Do you think he even thought about that? Probably not. But whatever task he was given at the time, he did it, and he did it well, and he did it to honor God with faithfulness. I think Joshua he's a hero of the faith. So Moses promised to undergird his efforts with intercession on a nearby hill. Now, this is interesting. He would hold in hand his staff, symbol of the power of God at work among his people. Moses' reliance on the staff, however, did not exclude the action of Joshua. So what that phrase is saying there is that Joshua's actions were necessary for this success as well. It just wasn't Moses and what he was doing. So we have God. I want to talk to you about this. I'm just going to go ahead and ask you this question right now. So we're going to see. We saw here in the scripture that while the staff was held up, that they prevailed, and when it went down, they were overcome. And so they realized there was something to this, and they supported Moses' hands. So let me ask you this question: What was it about this, him holding the staff, that caused them to either prevail or to not prevail? Okay, so God is miraculously causing something here? Is that a possibility? Okay, that's a possibility. Okay. Okay, certainly. Oh yeah. Is there any other possibility? Okay. So it could have been for the men themselves that are on the battlefield, that when they didn't see the staff, that maybe they lost heart. Is that a possibility? Possible. Maybe both. I mean, we know of many cases where God was in one way or another behind their success or their failure in battle. Right? So moving forward throughout history, we know that there were times when they did what they were supposed to do and they prevailed in battle, and other times where they didn't and they weren't. That had to be because of God causing some things, willing them in a certain way. So there was something to this. It could have been, my mind, if you think of it from an inspirational point of view, that when the men they didn't have the staff to look at to fight. You guys, in the movie The Patriot, right? When the flag's retreating, what was happening to the people, to the men? They were losing heart, right? Turning tail. And then he takes that flag and he grabs it and he heads the other way with it, and that's a pretty cool scene. And then you see that flag moving forward is what inspired them to do that. Is that possible what was happening here? I don't know. I tend to lean more towards that there's something miraculous happening here. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Okay. Through His Word, if we keep our eyes on His Word, then it helps us prevail in certain circumstances. Okay. You guys have any thoughts as to what was happening here, the mechanism of what's happening with this battle? Right. Right, and I think we all agree on that. The question is, was it something miraculous that was occurring that was giving them the victory, or was it through the inspiration of seeing the staff that the men were able to prevail? Again, I tend to lean towards the miraculous here. Okay. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and that there's something to this as well. And there's a lot of neat lessons that we can learn here when we talk about that, because we're going to find out moving forward that did Moses think this through ahead of time about this, that he was going to need to keep this thing aloft the whole time by himself? I mean, they were kind of making decisions on the go here, weren't they? And so sometimes I get the impression, I think we're going to find out too, that Moses was trying to do everything on his own. Right. Something to this. Yeah. Now, as long as the Israelite fighters could see the upright staff of Moses on the hill, they prevailed in battle. When the staff was lowered because of fatigue, however, the course of the battle changed. Now, noting this, a stone was rolled into position for Moses to sit on. Aaron and Hur stationed themselves on either side of him and propped up his hands. Now, Jewish tradition tells us they think who this Hur was. Hur was the husband of Miriam, Jewish tradition. Joshua was thus enabled to overcome the Amalekite army. Now, here's a devotional note. Some of you have made reference to this. Battles as well as blessings mark the course of a believer's pilgrimage. Sometimes the Lord fights for His people, as at the Red Sea. And sometimes through His people. That's how the Lord operates, through His people. So in this case, we might have a little bit of both taking place, where God is fighting for them, but they had to be engaged in the battle themselves. In any case, believers can be confident that He who is in their midst is greater than any enemy which may be encountered in the way. Now, Moses was told to write this, it says, quote this, namely, the victory of Amalek, and to the prediction of Amalek's destruction. 5 times in the Pentateuch, Moses was told specifically to write something. That Joshua was destined for even greater leadership is clear in this incident. I think we've already talked about that. Now, to commemorate the victory of Amalek, Moses created an altar and called it Yahweh Nissi, my banner. The Lord is my banner. All of Israel needed to realize that they fought under the banner of God. And then Moses proclaimed a perpetual hostility of Yahweh toward the Amalekites. A devotional note here: those who attack the people of the Lord incur the wrath of God. Another book of the Bible that speaks about that quite in depth is what? Revelation. Yep. So we've had multiple different problems: problem of war and thirst and food and thirst and all these kind of things that are going on, different things that occurred, and now we see that they have the problem of leadership. Problem of leadership. So Exodus 18 narrates how Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, visited the Israelites while they were in the vicinity of Mount Sinai. Okay, now, we've already seen the word Horeb, right? They're in the vicinity of Mount Sinai, is where he struck the rock, right? And who's close enough by to come visit? And where was Jethro from? I was saying there's more evidence here. I don't think Jethro had to come far when he saw this group of people coming. I think he wasn't too far away that he could come and see Moses. So, Jethro's arrival, verses 1 through 8. Now, Jethro, the priest of Midian. Now, this is interesting. The priest of Midian. Like a Jewish priest? Some think so. Some think so. So, we have the priest of Midian. We know he's been referred to this way, Moses. Moses' father-in-law heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Verse 2. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah after he had sent her away, and her 2 sons, of whom one was named Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And the other was named Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was camped at the Mount of God. Mount of God, Sinai, Horeb, Midian, Jethro. I'm saying that burning bush and all that, when he says you will come and worship me on this mountain, it's the same place, and I think it's, yep, there's just evidence after evidence, isn't there? Now, and he sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. There's an interesting word in there if you haven't picked up on it yet. Then Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. Verse 8. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had been following them on their journey, and how the Lord had delivered them. Now, there are some that believe that at this point that Jethro is not a believer, is not worship Yahweh. And that this event is his conversion. So let's keep that in mind. Some say that. I won't say who the some are, but so Jethro's arrival. The report of what God had done for the Israelites had reached the ears of Jethro sometime after the circumcision episode en route to Egypt. Remember that? With Moses, Zipporah and his son. Remember where Moses was struck ill and they had to do that, and she's like, you're a man of blood, I'm out of here. And he sent her home. You guys remember all that? So sometime after that, Moses had sent Zipporah and his 2 sons back to Jethro. Now Jethro sent word to Moses that he was coming to meet him with Zipporah and her 2 sons. Now, what do you think's behind that word? She's married? No, these are Moses, huh? These are Moses' children. Yes. Jethro would say that? Yeah. No, that's what you do to me. You need to come get your daughter. No. Well, there's something, I think there may be something to that here, but in a different way. Okay, you are grandpa of these two boys. She's your daughter. They're your grandkids. And I'm coming out to you with her two sons. What's that saying? Not your son. Saying that could this have been a slight? Well, maybe just saying that she's the one that's raising them because you were doing this. Could it have been a slight? I don't know. It is interesting that it says that two different times. Her two sons. Was this intended as a mild rebuke to his son-in-law? In any case, Moses went out to meet Jethro and greeted him respectfully and warmly. Inside his tent, Moses rehearsed at length all that Yahweh had done to the Egyptians for Israel's sake. So he's recounting to him. And you know what? At this point, I don't believe so. We'll see moving forward. I'm racking my brain here. Because, I mean, he does take another wife. Right? Eventually? A Cushite wife? Or is that like later on? We'll find out. I haven't gotten that far in my studies, but keep that in mind. Moses' wife. So, now, just inside this tent, did they have any relationship before Moses and Jethro? Yeah. So, and you can just hear Moses telling Jethro of all that had happened. Did he have a story or two to tell? I mean, you know how it is when you're reunited with someone after a while and you've got some stuff you want to tell them. I mean, that would have been a neat place to be a fly on the tent wall. Yeah. I mean, I think we have every indication they had a good relationship. Yeah. So that would have been a very neat thing to see, to hear. So, Jethro's confession. Interesting, verses 9 through 12. And Jethro rejoiced over all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel in delivering them from the hand of the Egyptians. So Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. Indeed, it was proven when they dealt proudly against the people." Verse 12, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God. So there's burnt offering and sacrifices here that this man is conducting. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at here. Where is if this is his conversion event, we're going to jump right into offering sacrifices? It doesn't, does it? It seems like there's some sort of previous relationship here with Yahweh, and that he already knows what he's supposed to do, and that he did this and all this together. You know, I don't think I would be so bold as to, that now I'm a believer, and now I'm going to be the one that's conducting sacrifices and offerings to the Lord. Like an hour after. Yeah, the priest of Midian. Yes, and it's mentioned earlier too. So I think this is evidence that he was a believer all along, even way back. So Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things which Yahweh had done for his people. He burst forth into praise to Yahweh. Now, Doc Smith, and I agree with him, this is not Jethro's conversion, as some commentators imagine, but his elation that his own God had been so gracious. First, Jethro praised the Lord for rescuing Israel from the hand of the Egyptians and Pharaoh. Now, based on this dramatic experience of divine power, Jethro expressed renewed confidence that Yahweh was greater than all the other gods. Now, you can imagine he's living in a land of idolatry and all the other gods, knows what's going on in Egypt, sure, and he's seen everything in the world. And now he has further confirmation that Yahweh is the one true God. When it says in verse 11, now I know, this isn't a new realization. This is a confirmation of what he already believes. Yes?
Can we point out here that these people are not too far removed from Noah? I mean, what are they? One generation removed from Noah?
No, we've got quite a few years in between. I believe so. Yeah, because it's Noah, and then we have the time period of the dispersal, and then Abraham. Yeah, there's been a long period of time, a few hundred years.
But he could have been.
Could have been what?
One of the people that, they took him into Egypt. There was people left that didn't get taken captive, right? He could have been one of those people.
That he was a Jewish person?
Right.
I don't think we have indication here that he was a Jew.
You don't think so?
Mm-mm.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, no, because we.
When he took the people captive, surely there were some that were left.
They didn't start out in captivity. They started out in free will. Those going in captive, all the family needs to come in and all the family.
Yeah, I don't know that we know that Jethro was Jewish. In fact, I've even seen where it said he was Gentile. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what his lineage was beyond that. So, but I mean, he has some. We don't know how he got to be what he was. But I think it's evident that he was a worshiper of Yahweh. So this is not Jethro's conversion, but his elation. So he praised the Lord for rescuing Israel, and he realized with renewed confidence that Yahweh is greater than the other gods. The word know does not necessarily mean came to this realization, but rather means know by personal experience. Through Moses, he now has all these evidences and confirmation that Yahweh was indeed the one true God. All right, so Jethro then offered a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. Now, Doc Smith says maybe this is even the basis of Aaron's learning. Aaron and the elders of the nation were invited to eat from sacrificial meal with Jethro in the presence of God. From Jethro, Aaron may have learned the priestly craft. He may have learned something here because Aaron's going to have some unique responsibilities moving forward, right? What doesn't Aaron know yet? What's in store for Aaron? A priest? The first high priest. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we'll stop there because I don't want to push this next thing. There's a lot in this. It's one page of stuff, but there's a lot of really good nuggets of truth and wisdom in what this next part of the passage talks about, Jethro's counsel. Okay, any questions or comments on anything we covered so far tonight?